Hello, and welcome to Unexplored Games, a channel dedicated to lesser known and unique board games. Today I'm talking about Meltwater, a game of tactical starvation. This game is designed by Erin Escobedo, and it's a two-player game about the US and the USSR trying to survive on Antarctica after a nuclear war. This is the last habitable land. My copy was purchased from Hollandspiel. You can see that logo right there. They make games, they publish games that are really just lesser known games. It's not, you're not going to get your normal everyday kind of game from Hollandspiel. And unfortunately, they no longer publish Meltwater, which is bad for us because we can't get it, but good for Erin Escobedo because it's going to a larger publisher here in the near future. Because they were ending their publishing of Meltwater during their big sale, I actually got a copy of Meltwater with with yellow discs instead of the normal black ones, which makes it feel a little. I don't mind it. I've seen photos of it with the black discs, and it does look more ominous with the dead hexes, but it works for my purposes. I'll be giving a brief overview like I normally do, and then I'll talk about some gameplay mechanics, and then at the end I will do my final thoughts. I'll put chapters in the description, so it should show you chapters in the scroll bar below, and then you can skip around if you'd like. So, like I said, Meltwater is a game set in the Antarctic, where you have the US, which is represented by these blue folks here, and the USSR represented by the red units on the map. It's in an unknown year in the 20th century, and the idea is to be the last unit standing. Let me actually quote the rulebook for the setting. "19XX, the unthinkable finally happens. The world is scoured clean in nuclear fire. The oceans are poisoned for generations to come. One last patch of habitable land remains, Antarctica. The remnants of humanity huddled together in a fragile patchwork of research stations and refugee ships. But even here, the Cold War survives, and our civilization may not." You can also see here in the rulebook that the objective is to annihilate the enemy. Be literally the last unit standing. The rules also clarify that you win the moment that your opponent has 0 units. To quote the rulebook yet again, even if your units would be doomed to death later in the same turn, with your last breath, spit on your enemy's grave. Pretty intense, and if you combine this with the quote in the very beginning of the rulebook from General Thomas Power, an Air Force general during the Cold War, he says, "Restraint? Why are you so concerned with saving their lives? The whole idea is to kill the bastards. At the end of the war, if there are 2 Americans and 1 Russian left alive, we win." I'll come back to this brutal sentiment at the end, but for now, let's actually talk about the gameplay and how the game works. Hollandspiel describes the game as an intro for the wait, but I would agree with Board Game Geek that it's probably a medium, maybe medium light game. It's about an hour long, and it's really nice for something that you want to play that has some depth that you don't have to spend 2-3 hours playing, like some of the heavier games my wife and I like playing. The box also lists the solitaire suitability as high, and I would agree. Since it's a 2-player game with open information, you just play both sides, like you would a lot of war games. There's 0 hidden information, and everything is out in the open, which is pretty great design. So let's talk about this game board. As you see here, we have the blue units representing the US, and the red is the USSR. This is the quick setup. You can play a more complicated setup where you place units based on the color of these stations, and then each person gets to choose to place other units on the board. But just for illustration purposes, I'm going to start with a quick setup. You see the USSR kind of clustering on the right-hand side and the US in the center, but you also have a couple of these units in the far left. And to talk about this game, it's kind of hard. I want to keep wanting to use cardinal directions, but because it is the South Pole, like this is north, but so is this, and so is this, and so is this. So it's kind of hard to talk about like cardinal directions. So I'll be using left, right, top, and bottom when I talk about the game. Each player on their turn goes through 3 phases in order. They go through a starvation phase, where units that are on hexes that cannot support the population they die. So each hex can only support so many units. Normal units or hexes can support 2 units. Ice hexes, these blue ones here, can support an extra 1. You'll see a +1 on here. And then hexes that are bordering the ocean, those can support -1. And these stack, but they don't stack with each other. So for instance, you'll see this hex, it has a -1 on it because it's a normal hex, but it's next to the water. So instead of being able to support 2 units, it only supports the 1. Whereas this hex here, it's the blue hex. This is an ice hex, so it would support the 2 for being a normal hex plus 1 for being an ice hex. But because it is adjacent to the sea, it's going to be -1. So that +1 and the -1 cancel out. So you just have a hex that supports 2. Throughout the game, during the Doomsday card resolution, which is the 3rd phase, you'll be placing these discs on the board. And these are dead hexes. They can support 0 units. And every hex that is adjacent to it, they are dirty hexes. They have -1 support. So in this scenario, this can support, instead of the normal 2, it supports -1, so 1. This one, instead of the 3, because it is an ice hex, supports 2. They do not stack. So even though this is adjacent to 2 dead hexes, it's still just -1 for being dirty. So on your turn, and on the very first turn, you skip the starvation phase for both players. On your turn, you're going to figure out which units starve. And as the game progresses, you'll have more and more of these. Actually, let's do an example here. I'll do that example at the end. There are 3 different outcomes for our starvation. A unit will flee the hex if they can, flee to a friendly hex if possible. If they can't go to a friendly hex, let's say there's nobody there and this was this much population, so 3 units on a 2-unit hex, they would try to flee if there was maybe a person there. Or they would try to, afterwards, if they can't flee, they would defect, moving to a hex that has a unit of a color that is not shared with them. And when they defect, they actually become the other color. So they become your enemy's units. And then finally, if they cannot do any of that, they die, being removed from the game completely. And this is pretty cool. It's the crux of the game. And I would say it does a good job of telling some nice stories. At one point, I moved some units around so that my unit would actually die instead of defecting. Because as General Powell says, we want to have just the last unit standing. And because starvation happens at the beginning of the turn, that means that whatever actions you take, which is the next phase, will be the starvation phase. The results of your actions will actually be resolved by your opponent. That's the starvation phase. It's the first of 3 phases. It's a pretty important phase, and I'll actually talk a lot about it in my final thoughts. But for now, let's move on to actions. In general, your actions are meant to keep your units from starving. You don't want to have a situation where, for whatever reason, now you're surrounded by these dead hexes and can no longer, all your units will die off. And the point of the game is to have the last unit standing, so that would be a very bad outcome. But as I mentioned earlier, units don't only starve, they can defect. So you don't want that happening either. And to prevent that, you actually have a few options. First, you can just simply move your units. I'm not going to go into exact rules here, just kind of a brief overview. So please don't start writing in the comments how wrong I am about the way I move my units here. You can move units, you can recruit some of these neutral forces to your side. You can use these military units to push your opponent back. Sometimes you can do that and actually force them to starve on the next turn, which is pretty brutal sounding. And it feels pretty brutal too when you're on the receiving end of that. You can also use your military units to kill enemy military units, removing both of them from the map and actually causing another hex to die as a result. The ultimate goal is to keep your units on hexes that can support them while forcing your enemy units onto hexes that will starve the next round. And this can actually lead to some really depressing decisions that you make. I mentioned earlier that I actually made a couple of my units move into a space where they were destined to starve. They weren't going to be able to flee to a friendly space. They weren't going to be able to defect. And I didn't want them to defect. I could have moved them to a place where they defect, but that would have helped my opponent. And the goal of the game is to have the last unit standing, so you don't want to give your opponent units. The next phase, so I've done the starvation phase, the action phase, and now we're going to talk about these cards, the Doomsday phase. On each card, and I'll zoom in on this, On each card, let's see if I can zoom in right now, see how this looks. Ah, perfect. On each card, you have 2 black hexes and 1 white hex, as well as a diagram of the map where these events happen. So after you do the starvation phase and the actions phase, you do the doomsday phase. For each of those black hexes that are, you've noticed in the map they're labeled, you place a new marker and it kills that hex. That hex can no longer support any life at all. And the hexes that surround it now are dirty, meaning they support 1 fewer unit. So in this example, because I have killed off D3 here, this unit now, when the next starvation phase comes around, this can only support 1 because it's 2. It is normally 2 for being a normal hex, adjacent to the ocean, so -1, and now being dirty, another -1 because it can support 0. This unit will have to either flee to a friendly hex, or if neither of these were here, they would defect to this red hex. You can't really see that, it's kind of off camera, but you get the idea. Additionally, this white hex on these doomsday cards, that is where a new neutral unit will come in, and those neutral units, they can be recruited like I said earlier, and then they also can starve and die. The very nice thing about the way the game is set up is that you always have 2 of these doomsday cards visible, the one that is going to come up next and the one that's coming up after that. That's really nice because the current player is the one who chooses which hexes die when situations arise like this. After this one is resolved, the next person is going to be resolving this card, which would place a doomsday marker on D3, but D3 already has a doomsday marker, so this will go onto a unit of, or a hex of their choice adjacent there, which if this unit didn't die would probably go there if it was the USSR's turn. They would kill that unit off and threaten the rest of these here. So having both of them visible is super important for doing any sort of strategizing, and kind of removes a bit of randomness, which is kind of nice. The designer, Erin Escobedo, mentions in her design diaries that some of these really useful designs were, I'm not going to say happenstance or chance, but weren't initially apparent to her. And she's like, well, what if we do this? And it ended up working beautifully. I will be talking about the design diaries at the end, and I will link them below in the description, so please check them out. There's only 3 of them. They're pretty short, but they're pretty interesting. And that's the 3 actions. After you do the starvation, the 3 phases: starvation, then actions, then doomsday. You rep around to the next player doing the starvation. So after you've placed these markers, then you starve off your units. And it really, as the game nears the end, things feel more and more desperate as more of these doomsday markers get placed, and you have to start being pressed into the center. One really cool thing about this deck of cards here is that I think almost all of the hexes that are listed are around the edge. So as the game progresses, the usable part of the map is smaller and smaller, and it pushes you in. They're not randomly placed. They're going to start going on the edges and then slowly move in, making the continent more and more and more cramped. And this was an accident, but it really shows a kind of nice situation here. Sometimes you might have a few units off to the side that might be your only chance of survival. I've tried to use that strategy and rely on these units over in the left-hand corner here, and that didn't work out very well. So be forewarned that if you decide to try to rely on these units, it might not work, but it might. Those might be the only ones surviving at the end of the game. Everyone else is killed off from starvation or military action or what have you. It's also easy to forget that you can forfeit at any time. The rules do mention that if you ever feel like the game is going to come to an end regardless of what you do, or it's obvious one player is going to win, you forfeit. And what happens to your units is they end up surviving and they pretty much just defect to your opponent, but they survive. And then they rebuild society. To, again, go back to the rule book, I keep going back there, but there's some really good notes in there that I don't want to quote verbatim. There may come a point in the mid to late game where your opponent is guaranteed to win, or at least strongly favored to win. If this happens, the designer recommends that you forfeit with dignity. Your civilians surrender and become citizens of the victor. With the war finally behind them, this last remnant of humanity can shore up the coasts, stop the advancing meltwater, and fortify against the long winters to come. So between that statement where you can forfeit and everyone kind of tries to survive as a human race instead of as countries that really don't even exist at this point due to the nuclear winter state of the world, it's easy to forget that you can just kind of quit and that these are representing real people in a way. And if you read this design diary, you'll notice that Erin Escobedo mentions that there's enough room for everyone. If one person were to forfeit at the very beginning of the game, then all the people that these units are representing will survive. And there's enough to go around. So this fight is really artificial, which is the case of war in many ways too. Like borders are sort of artificial. They're not really there. Like why is the USSR fighting the US at this point? And you could say, well, it's because the game designer designed it this way. But remember that quote from the beginning, like this was a real state that a lot of people were really thinking about. They were saying, let's kill the bastards. We just want one American standing when there's no Russians standing. And it reminds me of the 1983 movie with Matthew Broderick, War Games. The only winning move is not to play. Which is kind of true. Like if you're talking about humanity and not just like winning a game between your friends or your spouse or whatever. If you're talking about humanity, the only real winning move here is to not play, is to say, all right, we set it up, I forfeit, everyone survives. And it's kind of a fun thing to realize. I didn't read these diaries until I've played this game a handful of times. I'm like, oh, this is cool. I like the pressing in. That's unique. And then I read the design diaries and I'm like, whoa, that's a really interesting tidbit that this war could end in the first turn, and that there's enough to go around. And, you know, combining that with a horrible, horrible quote from the very beginning from that Cold War general really gives you a kind of a different understanding of what you're doing on your turn. Like I said, there was a point where I killed off my own people so that the Russians didn't get them, the USSR, the Soviets didn't get them, which feels kind of gross when you actually think about what this is representing. I know, you know, war games in general, you're representing killing off and et cetera. But that feels different than a decision to intentionally kill your own units for no other reason other than I don't want my enemy to have these people. Dark stuff. That being said, this game's fun. I like it a lot. There is... I've never played a game that's so dark that is still really fun. Then that might be one of the best parts of this game, is that I'm having fun doing these terrible things or making these terrible decisions. You're having fun killing off some of you. Like I keep telling that one story where I intentionally kill off some of my units because it's kind of a crazy thing to do in a game. I've done it in other games, and I'm sure you do it a lot in chess, but when you're actually talking about starvation, it's a little different for me. I'm not sure why, but it feels a little different. You make it impossible for your units to survive because you just don't want your opponent to have them. Dark stuff, but a ton of fun moving your units around. I really recommend this game. The moment that the new publisher is announced, I'll put some sort of link, one of those pop-up things that YouTube has, those little gray bars, and I'll put it in the description. I will for sure link to this game once it's released again. I hands down recommend this game. I also recommend a lot of other Hollandspiel's games. I'm planning on doing a couple videos of games designed by Amabel Holland from Hollandspiel, This Guilty Land and The Vote, which are very similar. But I'll be reviewing those soon. Keep an eye out for those. And that's Meltwater. A great game. Please try to pick it up used if you can find it, or keep an eye out for whatever publisher. Erin Escobedo has not announced that which publisher it's going to, just that it's going to a publisher. I don't have a timeline for that either, but I'm a part of a couple board game communities online that she's also a part of, so I'll be sure to keep an eye on that and probably hear about that pretty quickly after it does happen. I'm also... My process for making these videos is I usually write kind of like a long form script. You might see me referencing some pages. I have some over here I've looked down at that might be obvious. But I usually write a long form script, turn it into bullet notes and then bullet points and then kind of ignore them. That's why I ramble so much. But I figure if I'm writing these full scripts, why not post them somewhere? So in the next couple weeks, probably after I edit this video, actually, because I need some stills from it, the next couple weeks I will be starting a website that has every video that I do, just like a text version of the, I don't know if to call these reviews, these overviews, whatever they are. So if you're interested in like more text versions of things, keep an eye out for that. And like usual, thanks a lot for watching.